Today we're going to be cooking grains and legumes. Now, let me begin by telling you a quick story. 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, our nomadic ancestors wandered out of Africa to the eastern Mediterranean, and they found a veritable Garden of Eden. The conditions were perfect for abundant vegetation. Among that vegetation, stands of wild grain. Now, they had a big idea, and that idea took hold pretty quickly. The idea was simply this: rather than wandering as nomads in search of food, shelter, and water, maybe we could stay put and manipulate our environment to give us those things that we need for survival. That big idea was the seed out of which modern agriculture grew. From that day to this, almost every culture has hitched their wagon to some combination of grains and beans. And there's a good reason for it. This combination, nutritionally, is a powerhouse. Together, grains and legumes will give you complete protein, especially in the absence of abundant meat. So think about it for a second. In Asia, they have rice and beans, soybeans probably. In India, they eat rice and all manner of lentils. Here in the United States, we eat wheat and beans. We have peanut butter, and we have that with corn and bread. You get the idea. There's all kinds of grains out there. There's oats, there's wheat, there's rye, there's barley, sorghum, wild rice, quinoa, teff. It sort of boggles the mind, but every culture, it seems, has hitched their wagon to some grain to fuel their existence, and likely combined it with some bean as well. Let's get cooking. I'm going to start with beans, so let me take these grains away, and we'll bring these over. You can see here I have garbanzos, black beans, cranberry beans, and cannellini beans. I want to talk a little bit about cooking beans. So let's get things rolling. There's a sheet pan here, or a cookie sheet you might call it. Beans are an agricultural product, minimally processed, so it's not a bad idea to spread them out and see if there's not little pieces of dirt or even a stone or two. Spread them out like this, and you may find just something like this. You may also see some old or broken beans that you want to discard, and those go right into the garbage. We'll take those and put them back into a bowl. And these beans now are ready to be washed and then soaked. I'm going to set them aside. What I have here is some beans that have been washed and soaked. They should be soaked in abundant water. So typically I have 2 or 3 times as much water as beans. I don't want them to ever go dry. So if they're so thirsty that they drink up 2 times as much water, then 3 I think is appropriate. 3 times as much water as beans, and I let them soak overnight. Usually I'll put them in the refrigerator because at the end of the day, beans still represent protein, and I don't want them to be sitting at room temperature. We're going to take these beans and put them into a pot. And I'm going to top just a little bit more water so they're covered by about a half an inch to an inch. And we'll turn them on and begin cooking them. Let's say you don't have enough time to let them soak overnight. Maybe you forgot, maybe you were busy. There's a quick soak method that you can use where you take the beans, cover them with abundant water, bring them up to one boil them for a minute or 2, and then turn off the heat and let them sit for an hour or so before you carry on. Now, there's a good reason not to do that every time. If they soak and rehydrate slowly overnight, chances are the beans will get fuller and will be less likely to break apart when you cook them. I have a pot of beans right here that have been cooking for some time now. I'm going to dip in there. They've swollen a little bit. They're probably twice the size they were when they were raw. And what I want to do is talk about evaluating doneness. They've been cooking for an hour. I think beans like this take about an hour, hour and a quarter. So take a bean out, and what you want to do is just put it between your thumb and forefinger and smear it. And if it feels grainy or coarse or anything but velvety smooth, those beans are not cooked yet. All right. I have another pot of beans that's cooked all the way, and if I grab one of those beans and I smear it between my thumb and forefinger, it's just velvety. There's no white chalkiness to this bean at all. You can also pop it in your mouth, and maybe that's an easier way to test it because your mouth is very sensitive. If it feels dry, sandy, grainy, chalky, those are beans that are not yet fully cooked. So we've got it cooking here for about an hour. I want to talk briefly about flavoring. In this particular pot, I'm going to flavor it with some herbs and garlic. Whole cloves of garlic can go in there. I put in 3 cloves. You might choose to flavor it with a branch of sage, which I have here, but I'm going to put rosemary. Maybe a 6 or 8 inch piece of rosemary in there, and a couple of bay leaves. That's all. So that can cook very happily, and the beans will absorb the flavor of the garlic and the herbs as they cook. If you have these beans on for more than an hour, hour and a half, and they just don't seem to be getting done, you have to ask yourself what the problem is. It could be simply that they're old beans, that they're extra dry and they need more time to cook. But more likely, there's another problem, and that other problem is that beans don't like salt early on. It keeps them from getting tender. And they don't like acid especially. That can keep them from getting tender. So if you have a pot that's been cooking for an hour and a half and it's not nearly done, I would say if you haven't added salt, chances are your water is hard and that extra acidity is keeping the beans from cooking to tenderness. There's a little test you can do. I've got some baking soda here which will react to acidity. If I take a little pinch and I add it to the pot, you can see it start to bubble up. That is the acidity in this water responding to this baking soda, and that baking soda will neutralize the acidity. That wasn't a particularly active response, but if you have very hard water, sometimes it'll bubble up. Don't add a lot of baking soda to the water to neutralize acidity, because ultimately it can make your beans just fall apart altogether. Instead, a little pinch. I would say in a pot like this, any more than 1/4 teaspoon is too much. So a little pinch, and just test to see if that's the issue. And if you see a response, then 1/4 teaspoon, no more. Too much baking soda, and your beans will start to taste a little bit soapy, and that's not something you want. So let me move this aside, and we'll bring these beans over that are cooked. Once they're tender, once you've smeared it between thumb and forefinger, then you can think about adding salt. And I've got some salt in here already, but I'm going to add a little bit more. Because these are white beans, I'm not going to use black pepper, but instead some pepper flakes, which gives me a nice little fleck of color. You can see that I still have the rosemary in here, and that can live there very happily. I want to take a little bit of this water and just taste it with you. It's like one of the best vegetable stocks you've ever eaten. The starch in those beans gives a very distinctive body to the cooking liquid. I can taste the bay and the rosemary, the pepper flakes and the garlic. Do yourself a favor and never, ever throw that out. In fact, beans should be stored in liquid. So keep them in that liquid, cool them in that liquid. Because we've added salt, that will help them hold their shape now that they're cooked, and everything's right with the world. So, well-cooked beans are a staple in my kitchen. Once you've cooked them, you might put them in a little plastic container like this with their liquid, cool them down, and then keep them either in the refrigerator or they freeze really well too. Now that you have cooked beans on hand in your pantry, you are ready for a lot of different preparations. Maybe the simplest would be to take a bowl and get some of these beans, scoop them up, put them right into a bowl with some of their cooking liquid, which is delicious, and then serve them simply with a really punchy olive oil. If you like the idea of sage, I'll put a couple of leaves of sage here. That could be chopped up and added. If you had cooked these beans, let's say, with a little piece of leftover ham or some bacon, it would also have a meaty, smoky flavor to that broth. But just as they are, I think they're delicious, assuming they're properly cooked, velvety, and you've held on to the well-seasoned water that they cooked in. Here's some other ideas for dishes that you can make when you have cooked beans on hand. Here, for instance, is a spinach salad. And the spinach salad has tuna with a garlicky mayonnaise and white beans. Very, very simple, but really delicious. A big squeeze of lemon and off you go. Here is a dish that has bitter greens, garlic and tomatoes mixed in. I've served it here with a little piece of sautéed chicken, but even on its own it tastes delicious. This is also the start of a great pasta dish, orecchietta with beans and a little bit of bitter greens and tomato. And then finally, a piece of fish that's been braised with white beans, fish stock, and saffron. A little drizzle of Pernod, a squeeze of lemon juice, and this right here is the flavors of the south of France captured in one plate. There is a whole world of grains out there for you to enjoy. We need to narrow our focus just a little bit so that we can learn some techniques that you might find valuable. So I've decided that we'll cook some rice today. And I pulled together a couple of different rices. Let me just talk about these briefly. Here I've got short grain rice. And short grain rice is the type of rice that's used in sushi, also in risotto, which we'll be making a little later on. It's about twice as long as it is fat. And the thing that makes it distinctive is that when it cooks, the starch is very, very sticky. So making a risotto will leverage that starchiness to create a wonderful creamy sauce. Just the same way that in Japan they leverage that stickiness to create a rice that will stick together into fingers or rolls. Now, in the middle here, what I have is medium grain rice. This is about 3 times as long as it is fat, and it cooks up significantly less sticky than short grain rice, especially if you know a technique like pilaf, which we'll be using here in a second. And then finally, long grain rice is about 5 times as long as it is fat. This particular rice is basmati rice, an aromatic rice, and when this cooks up, it tends to cook up very soft and fluffy. It doesn't stick together at all. Now, I have an outlier here. This is whole grain rice. This is brown rice, whole grain brown rice that's short grain. This has the bran layer intact, also the germ, so there's plenty of nutrition, but more than that, because of the bran, it takes longer to cook. If this rice cooks in 15 minutes, this rice takes nearly 45 minutes. There is an example of a whole grain that cooks very quickly, and I thought you might enjoy seeing it. This is quinoa, and quinoa, because it's so small, it cooks in about 15 minutes. Even though it's a whole grain with the bran and the fiber intact. So I'm going to make a rice pilaf. It's a great technique for taking rice and keeping it loose and fluffy. It cooks the grain in a measured amount of liquid, so you need to know what grain you're beginning with, otherwise you won't be able to measure the correct amount of liquid. We're going to cook basmati rice, and this uses about 1 part rice to 1.5 to 1 3/4 parts liquid. Take a look at what I have on the stove. I have a pan, and in here I've sautéed some onions. They've already turned translucent. I just turned the heat up. And what we're going to do is take this rice and add it to this pan and coat the grains with the flavorful fat that's already inherent in this pan. Give each grain a little oily coat to wear, which will protect it from sticking to other grains of rice. The other thing that's going to happen is that as I cook this rice, the outside starch on each grain of rice will gelatinize with the heat, and that gelatinized starch